Hello Greenstyle, I am Cynthia Hendrickson and I am very excited to invite you into my sewing loft today where I will show you step by step how to sew the Inspire Tights Moto version. So if you follow this video with me, you can sew the Inspire Tights Moto version from beginning to end. And if you'd like to find more of my videos, I am going to be a regular contributor to this Greenstyle YouTube channel, so make sure you subscribe and you'll get notified every time we add new videos. And you can also find me on my YouTube channel, which is So Casually Chic. Go ahead and subscribe there, where you will find the group sew-alongs that I host, one about every 6 weeks. We all sew the same pattern together, and we have some great times, some great fabric and pattern discounts, and also prizes at the end. I think you'll enjoy it. I hope you like this video. Happy sewing!
Now let's take a look at all the pieces you'll need to cut in order to construct your Inspire Motos. So you'll need 2 of the upper Pintuck panels, and it's very important that you trace all of those lines off of the pattern pieces and onto your fabric. In addition, you'll need 2 of the lower Pintuck panels, and you know these ones are the lower ones because they're a little bit smaller. And again, make sure that you trace all of those lines. Cut out 2 of the back pieces for your pants, and you'll need to cut these 2 as mirror images of each other. So when you open them up like that, now I have the right sides of the fabric facing upward and they are mirror images of each other. And if you're using the gusset option, make sure to cut out your 2 gusset pieces mirrored and cut the center crotch seam on the back pieces along that gusset line. These are the small pieces of the front leg that you'll cut. So you'll need the top of the front leg, and there you can see the front center crotch seam pointing in towards the center. This is going to be the middle section, and it's going to be just below the top moto patch part, and it'll be close to your knee. And then the final piece will be the very bottom, and this is the piece that's going to be down by your ankle. I recommend marking the outer side seam on all of these pieces with a piece of chalk or a pin or some kind of marking so that you know how to put them all together at the end. It's very easy to get them turned around. As you can see, my center section is right now. I have those upside down and the outer seam is facing toward the inside, so you don't want to get those mixed up. I recommend marking them when you cut out your pieces. For the waistband, you'll need to cut 2 outer and 2 inner. The only difference between the outer and the inner waistband pieces are that the outer pieces are slightly longer, and I use the same fabric on mine, which makes it even harder to distinguish. So I'm going to show you right here by putting one of the outer on top of the inner. Actually, I put one of the inner on top of the outer, and I'll hold it close so you can see. See, there's a tiny little strip at the bottom sticking out of one of them. It's about 1/8 of an inch longer. So I'm going to go ahead and put a couple of clips on my inner pieces, and that will help me distinguish them so I don't have to keep holding them up against each other. To start constructing our pants, we'll go ahead and start with the back piece, and we need to add that little gusset piece to it. It's a little triangle piece, and there are 2 of them, and I have used some wash away under tape to stick them together, but you can baste them along the edges using a basting stitch, or you can do both. When you cut them out, use the wash away under tape and then also use a basting stitch. Make sure that when you stick them together that the wrong sides are together so that the right sides, the pretty sides, are facing outward. And you also want the prettiest one to be touching the back of your pant when you pin it together right there. And you'll lay it along that center crotch seam along the bottom just like so, with the wider part toward the bottom, and you'll pin it right along the edge. And you may notice that tiny little pointy bit of the gusset is sticking off the end of the pant, and that is the way you need to line it up so that the 3/8 inch seam is right on the edge of the pant. So we'll take this over to the machine, and what I like to do is use my basting stitch, which is a straight stitch at the longest stitch length, and baste that gusset on there first before I use my serger machine. And that way I can just make sure that it's lined up exactly the way I want it. And here's a good look at that gusset stitched on. The stitch just starts a couple of inches above the gusset and then goes down all the way through, and I've stitched it right along that 3/8 inch seam allowance. So now we will take it over to the serger, or just use a stretch stitch on the sewing machine. I like to use my serger here, and I'm going to line up my left needle with the stitch line that I created with my basting stitch, so I know I'm stitching right on that 3/8 inch seam allowance. I'm starting at the bottom and stitching up through the top of the gusset, and then I'm just going to serge right off the edge. So I will again just stitch a couple of inches up above the gusset. We'll attach this back piece to the other one. There's a good look at that seam that I just made and the gusset that's currently laying underneath. And so what we'll do is we'll open out that gusset. And so now we've created a new curve on our back piece. And here is the stitch. And I like to press it so that the seam is facing away from the gusset. So I just pressed it with my finger there. And now I'm going to take the two back pieces and lay them right sides together and just pin all along that curve and use the gusset as a part of the new curve. So right there, I'm pressing the seam away from the gusset, and I'm just lining up that edge, and that little section where the gusset meets the pant, just push it as close to the edge as you can, and you're going to go over a little part where the seam is folded back, the seam that you created and that comes off of the gusset. It's going to be folded back a little bit, and just make sure that as you're stitching that stays lined up with the edge of the other back piece, and you're going to catch that within the seam. So that little bit that's missing from that fold is just going to be taken up into the seam. So just pressing the seam away, keeping those edges lined up right there, and carefully serge 3/8 of an inch. And then you'll serge the gusset onto the other back piece and just line up those edges. At this point, you just want to check it to make sure everything looks good, to make sure that the gusset is smooth and that there are no puckers or folds in it. You can top stitch right along here if you would like to. You can also add another stitch just over what you've just done, and that will reinforce that back edge, and that's what I'm going to do. So I'm just going over exactly again what I did just a moment ago, but with my knife off. And now I'll have a nice and sturdy back seam. Now for the fun part. This is how we are going to create those lovely pin tucks on our Moto pants. So I am showing you that I have all the lines drawn on my fabric. It's hard to do on dark fabric, but I don't have a piece of chalk that I really like using. So I have some dark lines in wash away, it's like heat and water soluble fabric pen. And what you want to do is just right along that line fold so that the line is right at the edge of that fold. And you're going to stitch exactly 1/4 inch right along that fold. I think the best stitch for this step is the lightning bolt stitch on your sewing machine. You want a stitch that will be very stretchy because these are tights. There's going to be negative ease over your thighs, and so you want the stitch to be comfortable. You don't want something that doesn't stretch enough because then it'll dig into your legs and that won't feel good. So lightning bolt stitch, you could use zigzag stitch, but you want it to be narrow because you want it to be like you're stitching a straight line. If you're unsure about what you want to use, maybe stitch it over few lines over some fabric and then pull it over your leg and hold it there and see how that feels to you. But there's the first one done. And as you saw, I was just folding it carefully and stitching right along the 1/4 inch. It is important that you do it 1/4 inch for these pieces because if you make it too big, then your piece is going to be too small and you won't have room to cut out your pattern patch. It would really be disappointing if you stitched all of these lines and then went to cut out your patch and your new piece was too small. So really watch that 1/4 inch line. And how fun is this? It is so cool once you finished all of those lines to see them all. I really love this part. So what I like to do at this point is take my piece over to the ironing board and iron the pin tucks down so that they're all going in the same direction and that they're a little bit flattened, and that'll make it easier for cutting. Now that they're all stitched and ironed, we're at the table with our pattern pieces. And I want you to note that I've marked the grain, the stretch line, the bottom edge, and the side seam on all my pieces on the front. And then on the back, I've also marked the stretch and the bottom. And that'll be really helpful when cutting out the pieces to make sure that they're all cut correctly. And again, the bottom, the side seam, and the stretch. And notice I marked the stretch going all the way across. And that'll be really helpful because that is the line that needs to match your pin tuck lines. So lay the piece down and then look at the bottom because the pin tucks need to be facing pressed down toward the bottom. So make sure that they're all going in the direction toward the bottom, and then line up your pin tuck lines with that stretch line on your pattern piece. And once you have it all lined up with those things in mind, you're ready to cut. I like to use my acrylic ruler here even though I have the pattern piece because those pin tucks will stick up and it makes it easier to cut evenly in a straight line. And then to cut your other piece, make sure to turn the pattern piece over so that you get mirror images. Again, being very careful where the bottom is and where that stretch line is. Now this is where it comes in really handy to have marked the bottom, top, and side seam of all of these small little pieces, because when you put them all together, it is possible to put them in the wrong direction. And I won't lie, I actually laid them down wrong a couple of times and had to move them around and compare to my pattern pieces to make sure I put them down correctly. but you can see I'm pointing out that the pin tucks all should be facing downward, and that side seam is a very straight line, so you can lay it on your mat and lay everything against those lines to make sure that you have the pieces in the right position, and that very straight side seam will be a good indicator of that. Now at this point we're going to pin all of those pieces right sides together. So what I like to do is just flip them down one at a time on top of each other and get them pinned. Now this is one of those extra steps that I think is highly important. A basting stitch, which is a straight stitch with the longest stitch length, and you're going to use that to attach all of these panels together. And the reason that I say it's important is because there is a lot going on when you're attaching. You're attaching pieces that have diagonal cuts, and you're attaching pieces with pin tucks in them, and there's a lot that can create imperfections in your pieces. So basting them on will just make it so much easier if you need to take it off and put it back on. Right here, if this line isn't perfectly lined up, which can happen because of the diagonal, you will want to take it off and restitch it. So if you do that with a basting stitch, that will just help so much more. And then also when you head over to your serger or just are ready to stretch stitch these in place, it'll be so much easier to just stitch over the basting stitch. Now the reason I'm telling you to do this is because I learned from experience. I stitched these all on with the serger to begin with, and then I had to take a bunch of them out to fix. So this is a situation where do what I say, not as I do. So as you can see, they're all pinned here, and I'm just going to run them straight through my serger. Don't do that. Baste them first. But once you've got them basted, then you will use your stretch stitch or serger to stitch them all on. And right here I'm just showing you the little dog ear sticking out. Because you have pointy diagonal cuts, you will have some edges sticking out when you pin them together. And so just try your best to line up that point so that the straight edge is where the point is 3/8 of an inch thick. Right here you can see where some of my panels are offset a little bit, and that can happen really easily through the serger, so I had to take that off and realign it to get it straight. At this point you want to top stitch those panels to give them a nice finished look. So press the seam allowance away from the Pintuck panel and in toward the flat plain panel, and you're going to stitch right above that seam allowance. So you're going to be stitching on top of the plain panel. I like to use a zigzag stitch with a very narrow stitch width of 0.5 and then a slightly lengthened stitch length of 3.0, and that will give it just enough stretch so that it stretches over my body. And so you can see I have the seam allowance in toward that flat part, and I'm just stitching right on that edge there. And let's take a look. If it's a little bit wavy like mine is, you can just press it flat, but if it's extremely wavy, then you may want to decrease your tension just a little bit. Once you've constructed both front pieces, you'll need to stitch them together along this front center seam. Line up your two pieces with right sides facing each other, and then pin and stitch. Continue constructing our pants by attaching the front to the back pieces, and we'll first line up the front and back pieces along the outer side seams and get those all pinned. Stitch up those side seams using a stretch stitch or serger. Now for the inner leg seam. We'll start by pinning the front center to the middle of that gusset that's on the back, and we'll pin all the way down both legs. You just saw Penny the cat go by. I am going to slow motion as she comes back the other way. Look at her mouth. She has stolen a bobbin. And in real time she went by really quickly and I didn't even notice. That little stinker. I had to get it away from her later. Fortunately, before she had a chance to eat any of the thread. And now we are on to the waistband pieces. Here I'm showing you my inner lining pieces and then my main pieces. I went ahead and stuck a couple of pins on my lining pieces. Use whatever method works for you. That's probably not the best method. You could mark them with a pen or chalk or even stick straight pins in them. We will start by putting our matching waistband pieces together with right sides facing each other. So I have my two lining pieces together and my two outer pieces together. And we're going to stitch with a stretch stitch or serger down all of those short sides. Then take one of the waistbands and turn it right sides out. Once you have that turned right sides out, you're going to take it and put it inside of the other waistband and line up the top edges of the waistbands. Now, whenever I serge waistbands and end up with those serger seams on the inside, when I line up the two waistbands, I like to push one serger seam to the left and the other serger seam to the right, so that way they're adjacent to each other instead of on top of each other. And it makes the inside of the waistband less bulky. Now stitch all along that top to attach the two waistbands together. At At this point, you can add a piece of elastic to the seam right there. You do, make sure to add it to the outer waistband side of the seam. If you're unsure about whether or not you want elastic, you can always base the waistband onto the pant and wear it for a while and see if your waistband is staying up, and if it's not and you feel like you want to add the elastic, you can do so at that time. Check to make sure you know which is the right side of the waistband and open up the whole waistband. Line up and pin the bottom edges of the waistband together. And when you do that, open it up and take a look at those side seams and just make sure that they haven't twisted on their way from the top to the bottom. I strongly recommend that you baste along the bottom edge of that waistband. This will make attaching it to the pants so much easier and cleaner, and then you won't risk having any little holes or missed edges when you're stitching it to the pant. Mark the quarter points of the bottom of the waistband, so your two side seams will be quarter points, and then you'll find the center of the front and center of the back and mark them. And there you can still see my two pins that are showing me that the inner waistband is what's facing up on my table. And you are going to turn the waistband right side out and the pant inside out. Place the waistband inside of your pants and you're going to pin them together, matching the front and back centers and the side seams on the waistband with the side seam on the pants. Here you see me adding some extra pins because, full disclosure, I did not baste my waistband like I always preach to do. And I will not lie, I actually missed about an inch on my waistband and had to go back and fix it. We are going to stitch these using a stretch stitch or serger. And you will need to stretch that waistband just a little bit when attaching it to the pants. To hem your tights, you can use a few different techniques. I'll typically go over to my cover stitch machine, but you can also hem tights on the sewing machine. You can use a twin needle, which is a popular option, but today I'll show you that you can hem your tights on the sewing machine just using a zigzag stitch. Start by folding the edge of your tights back toward the wrong side and clipping in place. Did you know that these clips have measurement marks on them? If you clip all the way to the end of the clip, that's a 1/2 inch. There's also a 1/4 and 3/8 inches marks on there. I recommend that you play with your zigzag stitch on a piece of scrap fabric to determine exactly the length and width of the stitch that you like. I'm using 4.0 width, 3.0 length. The wider your stitch is going to give you more stretch, and the more narrow will stretch a little bit less, so try it out and see what you like.